terrifying.
Okay, I'm recording. The first person
Awesome.
records it says that, yeah. Okay, we're all recording. Okay, yeah, for some reason, Philip, I can't make you record. Like, option isn't for you. I'm not really sure why.
Because Philip is on his phone and he can't.
Oh, that makes sense then, yeah. It's on the
No,
computer.
no, my webcam is busted. Wait, does that mean you guys just aren't going to hear me? Am I not part of the recording?
No, you'll be part of the
Oh, no,
recording.
you're here.
It's okay, you'll be in the video. You just won't... okay.
Today's episode is going to be commentary on JoJo's recent tweet.
Yeah, so let's...
Yeah, this is pretty bizarre.
Way to open up about something like that. Fucking bulldoze that like button and subscribe.
Bulldoze that like button.
Is that how we're starting? I guess it's how we're starting.
Destroy that like button. Like it's
See.
so hard that you literally destroy your keyboard and you can't click on anything ever again. That's okay, because then...
Like that button for more controversial content like this.
Oh, we're
Yeah.
so controversial.
Yeah, so Joe Jorgensen recently tweeted, "It is not enough to be passively not racist. We must be actively anti-racist."
It's honestly a take you might expect more from the left, or at least from moderates, not so much from libertarians.
Like this tweet itself, it's relative. Like it makes sense. Like she's not supporting racism. She's condemning it. But we also have the responses. If you guys are looking at the responses, it basically is sarcastic and like facetious and saying stuff like, "Can I have my 40/40 back? I thought I was giving to a libertarian, not a Marxist." And then the other one is, "How exactly is that a libertarian viewpoint? If you're apolitical and you leave other people alone, that should be enough as a citizen, or am I missing something?" Yeah, so this is an interesting viewpoint, especially since you never like expect people to be uncomfortable with being anti-racist, right?
Well, you'll be surprised, Mico.
So it's just really weird. It's a really weird concept for me to grasp, like how someone can be against racism. Like how can someone be against some other person being against racism that's running for office? And I just want to, like, this is kind of in relation to ideals of the Libertarian Party, which is, like free speech, like allowing people to showcase their own viewpoints.
But it also contextualizes what, or at least in like an American lexicon, what we define as what being left is. Isn't necessarily that being versus policing, at least principally from people who supposedly want smaller government, or they don't want the state to have certain abilities to, impose their will upon the average citizen. Where would you think that the notion that being versus police brutality, or even being anti-racist, is somehow tied to Marxism?
I don't know where they got that. Like, I'm still lost as to like where they made that connection. I just thought it was more about the other people wanting a presidential candidate that wasn't infringing upon their rights. And I feel like they felt it was a right to be racist. It's like their own freedom and their own right to kind of think racist thoughts or things like that. I think like that's what it was.
I think that's what it seemed. I mean, I think that's what it seems like if you look at a more leftist view on racism. But I think in a lot of their views, they're not actually being racist. They're like, I have the freedom to say what I want. And you basically, like, even if you call it racist, I don't think it's racist. I mean, and a lot of times, a lot of them are like, yeah, I'm racist, and I'm. A lot of them could even say something. I mean, there's like, for instance, a local politician in my area who said, basically, he's like, he was saying like, oh, well, if you're going to keep calling me racist, then I'm a proud racist. He said something literally along those lines. So a lot of it also has to do with, yeah, you're right. Then a lot of them are just saying, I have the right to be, if you call it racist, sure, racist. But I think a lot of them don't necessarily. I mean, also different when we say libertarianism, what we call a libertarian party in the United States is very different from maybe what maybe politically or maybe from a theoretical perspective, what we define as libertarianism, or what people might call libertarianism in other frames of thought. I mean, because libertarianism in a very general sense could be, I mean, it could be leftist. It could be, rightist. I mean, you could say, for instance, there could be a more libertarian take on, say, socialism, for instance, which is maybe something more. I mean, even according, if you really bent the definition of libertarianism enough, you could even say like anarcho-syndicalism or what am I saying? Sorry, or anarcho-communism could be considered a form of extreme libertarianism in a way. It's just not right libertarianism. And I think in the United States, when we say Libertarian Party and things like that, we are associating with right libertarianism. So something which is supportive of like capitalism, private ownership, supportive of the free market, and so supportive of like basically people able to say whatever the heck they want, and without any restriction. But sorry, I guess setting that aside though, I think if you wanted to take a more general view on libertarianism, I would argue that yes, you do have to be anti-racist in the sense that systemic racism basically prevents people from being able to exercise their personal freedoms and liberty. As individuals who belong to certain groups of people. And I think that's a more left libertarian take on that whole thing. So that's a very long-winded way of saying basically that there doesn't make you not libertarian by being actively anti-racist or being actively even anti-conservative or anti-reactionary.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, which is why I was confused as to why people were suddenly so against JoJo for her support of Black Lives Matter and being outspoken about it. I think. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So JoJo actually clarified in a tweet that you can still say, for instance, Black Lives Matter without supporting the organization. The statement unto itself is pretty easily defensible, even if you don't like the way BLM is doing or going about it. And that was a tweet she put out later. But two things. One, I didn't like the response to the second response, which said aren't libertarians essentially apolitical? I think that's a misunderstanding of what libertarianism is. The bottom line, libertarians just think government should be less involved, but humans are political outside of whether or not government is there or not. Politics by definition is just getting people to act according to your interests, whether you're using power, soft power or hard power or not, or leveraging something else, you can still be politically involved and create some sort of grassroots bottom-up movement that tries to convey why racism is bad without asking the state to weigh in. So most left-leaning libertarians would be happy to do that for you. I think the problem is they just don't want the government to start deciding what is racist and what is not. Which leads to the other question, why people get upset at Joe for this. Without supporting it, I would say that the primary reason is that the term racist has become so expansive in the last 20, 30 years or so that even basic things like political references, being capitalist is now racist. Having qualms with environmental regulation is now racist. Preferring a specific type of criminal reform is now racist. So when they hear JoJo say, we must be actively anti-racist, they're kind of assuming she's operating under that definition, one, and then two, if you're anti-racist, there's probably some sort of punitive response from her if she's the president. So does that mean, using the power of the state to be quote unquote anti-racist? And I think that's where people are getting concerned, not necessarily rightfully so. The libertarian movement is in many ways anti-racist. If you consider police brutality to be an exercise in racial discrimination, then by definition, libertarians are anti-racist. So I think the main problem is the LP is home to a lot of Republicans who just don't like the GOP, and they want to think that the LP is Republican, but it isn't.
Republican plus.
Yeah, well, Republican minus, really, if you think about it, but still at its core, culturally conservative. And I think that's the fan base that's getting upset. That being said, a lot of libertarian Facebook pages are asking how on earth you could possibly get upset at Joe for making such a vanilla statement.
And would the conflation between this being Marxist a failure, is this some deep rung of American propaganda that was just so afraid of Marxism that just all these bad things happening, make all these bad things happen? Or is this actually a failure of, say, leftist messaging to actually decipher what the issues of policing are?
I think I understand why the people responding to Joe's tweets the way that they do are saying it's Marxist, because so like by their own admission, the founders of BLM are quote unquote trained Marxists. So if you go off of that definition, then you could make that claim. That being said, Joe did a lot of good for herself by clarifying that you can support the statement without having to say anything about the organization. If you're just supporting the statement, then no, it's not Marxist at all, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think you see this on the internet often, where people react to something assuming that that's kind of like the take they were like implying, basically. And like I mean, I find myself being guilty of that sometimes. I mean, so when people see the term anti-racist, they sometimes associate with what some people say is anti-racist, which in some extreme examples could include, say, something along the lines of, well, something along the lines of something that is actually Marxist, right? And so, and a lot of times though it's not, and it's kind of unfortunate that I have to associate something so like, which you should feel, I mean, okay, from a leftist perspective, is really just a matter of like human rights to be anti-racist. It's sort of they associating with it without really assuming what she meant. So yeah, you're right that it's good that you clarified. Yeah, because I mean,
would it be pigeonholy to just say that in order to achieve any of these justice, you have to concede to some sort of leftist perspective? I think the sort of win here is to say, hey, libertarians are also have qualms. This isn't necessarily something to do with the economics of leftist politics. This is just an obvious harm. I mean, Mitt Romney was able to march with BLM. I just think that this is sort of...
Yeah, I think when I'm saying left, I think I was saying more progressive. I was more equating with progressive.
Some people like to do this. They think they win. Yeah.
What we call leftist, I think, in American perspective, but I mean, on like an actual like objective scale or a scale internationally, this does not need to be leftist at all. I mean, people on the right, people who would be classified as the right on a more objective scale in the United States would definitely be considered anti-racist. I mean, like some people, for instance, would say Biden is right. So they say the Democratic Party is somehow economically right, and I've seen some compelling arguments for that. But like the point is, they still would be racist, or at least a lot of them would be openly anti-racist. Although I guess the way they might enforce that might be different in a way that it might not be, say, so much through like economically progressive means, but it would be through some other means, or maybe a little bit more, less guided by the government.
So what does it mean to be anti-racist? Like, what do people think the definition of that is?
That's another way you could say it's very... I mean, because example, if you say capitalism was racist, then you would have to be, in fact, anti-capitalist to be anti-racist. In that, if you said capitalism was racism, or some would say like, because a lot of, say, they'd say like Western values, Western philosophers, Western like figures we look up to are racist, then to be anti-racist would have to in some ways go against and sort of undo and very much look from a post-colonial critique. You have to make some like post-colonial critiques of, say, like Western society. And I know that a lot of people aren't ready for that, I guess, or like that's not something which they would support. Say taking such like a critical view on like say Western society or a lot of like the foundations, what we consider. So like example, if you'd say something was like racist, you might say like they'd say, oh, in general, like the foundations of society are racist. In that case, you have to kind of go against that. And a lot of people aren't. They would take that as like an attack, say, on their culture or their people or what they hold as being true. And so when people hear anti-racist, sometimes they think that automatically means it must be against their culture, against their identities. And so they take it as a personal affront.
Does just being critical of the West make you anti-racist, or is there more to it? Like, do you have to do a concrete
thing? I mean, I think possibly another in the realm of like perhaps how messaging for these things have failed. I mean, you could say that substantively Black Lives Matter's statement is good, but of course people still want to conflate it as like all lives matter is the right thing to say, which completely ignores any possible discourse. That's besides the point.
Oh, I personally think you can be actively anti-racist just by pointing out like racist instances other people do, or having these discussions with other people if you think it's like not, if you think it's not racist, it's yourself and you're just trying to tell people that you shouldn't be this way. I think having those discussions are helpful and like useful, and also one of the ways you can be actively anti-racist. Like even if it's just your friend or your family members, just trying to keep them in check is really important.
But I still think that the barrier that where this comes from is that people don't necessarily, they're going to be very charitable to themselves. They're not going to, hey, I'm racist. They think I'm a good guy. I make the right choices. My judgment is fair. So, but especially if you think about, a lot of people think, oh, saying someone is racist, being anti-racist is code for anti-white. I'm not saying that that's the perspective I'm taking.
I hear people say that.
But it's understanding that that's...
I've heard that too.
So the issue isn't necessarily that people don't want to be anti-racist. It just becomes, I think in the less charitable frame, people just see it as a chore. Like, oh, now I need to actively do all these things. I need to know all these facts. It sounds like homework.
So is that why probably turned off by that kind of sentiment?
I think that's one facet, but I think the second part is that perhaps in whatever detriment, however people have vitriolically, however they have a knee-jerk reaction to all this stuff, is that there's still people who think that all this is just a way to get at white people. And this goes from as far as like the average Joe who watches news and thinks I'm uncomfortable, I feel like they're trying to like come after me. And this goes as far as people who think that that the great replacement is happening in the United States. And this is just some active leftist tool to fight white people. So this is at worst malicious and at least negligent. Also, this just generally goes back to like the average guy they have all the responsibilities in their day. They don't necessarily want to get wrapped up in thinking they have to solve the world.
Well, I think related to what you're saying, especially towards the beginning of this whole, like, these 2 points you were saying, and maybe the first point, I think a lot of times people are libertarian or say they're libertarian because they basically don't want others infringing on the status quo and what they consider as their way of life. And so when they say libertarian, what they really mean is basically supporting their own personal freedoms to basically continue to live the way they want to.
Oh yeah, you're apolitical. Like you just don't want to do anything with the government.
That's what they see as what their form of libertarianism. And that's interesting because, yes, that is why sometimes a lot of the things what so-called libertarians in the United States have fought against are things where like, wait a second, wouldn't a libertarian actually want to fight, say, for like example, police brutality, for instance? I mean, from a libertarian perspective, that could be easily made as something libertarian to somehow be against police brutality and excessive policing, because that is showing excessive intervention of the state in the rights of the people, everyday people. But then you see so many so-called libertarians in the United States opposing these like action against police brutality. So I think that is part of it. I mean, also a lot of it is like a lot of times what they associate with like anti-racist rhetoric is things such as, I mean, there's lists like say there's like lists like 15 things that white people can do to stop racism, and then they feel like, wait, why are you targeting me for being white for this? So they say like, you're not anti-racist until you accept that white privilege is a thing, right? And then they see that and they're like, oh shit, well now you're just trying to make me go against me for being white, and so then they take it as a personal attack, again, a personal affront. So anyways, I think the point I'm trying to hit home is that I'm just trying to, I guess, confirm what you're saying, and saying it does have to do with, I think, a lot of times sort of how what people who like self-identify as libertarians in the United States, what they might be thinking.
No, I think Philipp self-identifies as a libertarian, or like he's closest to probably.
Yeah, I mean, but libertarian can mean a lot of things. I think that's one thing we were trying to get from this is that. Yeah.
I mean, one thing to note is, like y'all said, libertarian can mean many things. So, like, you could be libertarian and still be anti-defunding the police because, like, the horrifying alternative is private police forces, which is basically a glorified gang war, or letting everyone have a gun and try to police themselves. Also, historically, didn't work out too well. Like, if I recall correctly, the Bloods and the Crips were both community policing initiatives until they stopped. But regardless of all that, the whole anti-racist thing irking some people that are conservative, stems from, I guess, from their point of view, the fact that most of the time racism is mentioned in mainstream media, almost never because a minority did it. So like the definition that I guess neoliberals have coined is that you can't be racist if you're a person of color, which, you know, by process of elimination means there's only really one group that's capable of being racist, and that's white people. So
Yeah.
In the minds of like right-leaning libertarians, anti-racist just means anti-white, because every time they hear racist, it's immediately followed by a narrative about a white person. So that's the knee-jerk response, and I think that was part of the heat that Joe caught in making that statement.
Yeah, we're going to have probably a segment in the future about, or near future, about effective political activism. And I think that is one big thing, is like, are these kind of things that people are saying, I mean, whether or not you agree with, I mean, I'll admit that I definitely don't agree that only white people can be racist. I think that's a ridiculous concept, and it completely ignores so many, I mean, well, if we're going to talk about outside, wait, what?
You're gonna get so much hate from the left.
But it's because it completely ignores all the cases of like inter-POC racism in the United States. Also, if you look outside the United States, there's just so many cases of like other groups being racist to other groups. I mean, and like it shows that like social dynamics when you go outside the United States is like often very different. And so like if you want to say, and I mean, I could go more in depth, and if we get a lot of hatred, I will be forced to go more in depth about what I mean by this.
That's like another episode which you will get all that hatred from.
We'll go into that episode. Yeah, I'll clarify that.
Schrodinger's hate. Schrodinger's cancel.
Schrodinger's cancel. What I just said could get me canceled. Saying that they can be racist. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So basically, this is a take I saw. I believe it was in the Zoom memes page. Basically, it's like college level page group. And there's been a recent stream of like more political memes and like socially conscious memes, and I guess here's a tweet that I found posted there. People were taking this tweet in a little bit different ways, but basically political correctness isn't really a thing. I mean, we say political correctness, but really it's just, to be politically correct is just to show compassion and empathy for other people's struggles and their feelings regarding certain subjects. And this is something that a lot of people who are against political correctness don't want to admit, because they somehow like don't want to show, like they feel uncomfortable showing, say, empathy or like acknowledging other people's feelings, or somehow like acknowledging their own faults, or maybe say inabilities either to understand other people's feelings or to admit that somehow they have like sort of ignored other people's feelings. So I guess the question I have to ask is sort of, I kind of wanted to unpack the idea of, say, political correctness and sort of what we think of, especially kind of note, say, maybe what we want political correctness to be ideally and what it ends up manifesting in real life. Sort of like how does it actually work out pragmatically? So yeah, does anyone have any initial thoughts? Like,
well, as far as political correctness, this is a term that gets thrown around, particularly in people in conservative or right-wing circles. If you look back at even, I believe it showed up more in the 60s in the context like identity politics, but since now, especially with online discourse, it seems like, oh, everything's all politically correct now, something that people like to say. But there's all sorts of political correctness. It's politically correct to, have a nuclear family to some people. It's politically correct to not be gay. It's politically correct to be Christian. Just putting this sort of weight upon people who want to create change in society is sort of just also from a perspective of people have the comfort of being conservative, of being comfortable with the status quo, not having any need to want to change. It sort of makes it, as far as even political messaging, it's like most people have just learned to be pundits. As far as like being the average citizen, that is that this is just sort of way to make statements sound ingenuous. You don't actually care about these people. You just sort of want to sound better than the average person, because I'm obviously, and this is also tying with your sense of this is just, you're just having empathy. But as far as political correctness being a thing, I think in our current lexicon, it's sort of put on one side of our political frame, but we sort of also neglect the fact that there are also different sets of rules. There's different types of political correctness that people like to conform to.
do you guys think an interesting topic? Tying back to like our previous conversation. Do you guys think political correctness goes against like the concept of free speech?
I brought this up because this is, I guess, something which I don't see discussed too often. I guess like, people talking about like what that means. I mean, in some ways it is a taboo word to somehow use political correctness because it does imply sometimes that you might be like somehow you're just some edgelord if you're against political correctness. People often frame you like an edgelord, but I think
Philip, go.
Well, I was going to ask, what's an example of someone being politically incorrect?
comedians, for instance, comedians make certain jokes about say certain groups of people, or certain jokes even about their own groups that they belong to.
Dave Chappelle saying the alphabet people.
Yes,
Yeah.
or yeah, an example. Or for instance, who am I thinking of?
Louis C.K.
Russell Peters making jokes about other like members of the Asian diaspora, or like sort of making fun of his own background.
I think jokes and comedy is just like a different monster in and of itself. But I think maybe like if a governor goes up there and addresses, okay.
Justin Trudeau with blackface.
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Or dressing up in various like costumes from like other cultures.
Saying China virus.
Calling Mexicans criminals.
So I think that might be a good example where there's just enough give on either side. Like there's very little redeeming about Justin Trudeau wearing blackface, especially now since he's like so hyper left. You would almost think he was compensating for something, and now we know. But the one about like are Mexicans criminals or something, like on one hand there's probably a group of people out there who think that immigrants have a predisposition to crime of some sort. That being said, saying that immigrants are more predisposed to violence gets weird if you're having that conversation with an immigrant. So do you just not have that conversation because it makes them uncomfortable? Or, do you not care about their feelings and go full Ben Shapiro and just keep trucking on with fact?
Facts don't care about your feelings.
Yeah. Ben Shapiro literally bulldozes Palestinian home with facts and logic.
Oh, ouch. I felt that one.
So I think the point of political correctness is to address issues in a more sensitive manner and in a way that doesn't generalize people, right? Like that's the point of political correctness.
Right.
And I think that the issue comes in where one side is trying its best to be political correct and trying to encourage it, right? Like people, but they're trying to encourage more political correctness, right? And then another side is saying, like Christian said, it's kind of disingenuous, or it's like what I think is a problem is that they think it's a stifling of free speech and like whatever they want to say. It's a very interesting concept because like on the left, they are like opposed to this concept called tone policing, right?
Now we're going into that.
Yeah, so which is kind of like political correctness in a way, I think.
Be respectful of other people's tone. But couldn't you, I mean, here's the thing. I think if you frame it a different way, I think some things that people would say are politically not correct could also be examples of people expressing, say, frustrations regarding a certain topic. I mean, as an example, for instance, it's the recent comments, that were coming from Nick Cannon, for instance, regarding, like white people lack melanin, so they are more they've like somehow are like a little bit lower than people who have more melanin, and like they've sort of like grown to like only know evil basically. And so like he's saying that maybe due to his frustrations regarding recent things, but some would argue that what he said wasn't really politically correct either. Of course, other people would say it's not really politically incorrect because it's a form of punching up. I've heard people saying that. or saying that, oh, well, he shouldn't be canceled for that because we shouldn't really care about political correctness anyways. So, I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is that sometimes this is a common criticism I see of tone policing as a topic, even though you can acknowledge tone policing is a valid thing. Sometimes tone policing is used to, in itself, tone police someone else. As in, by tone policing, someone accuses you of tone policing, you're like, wait, but you're accusing me of tone policing because by what I'm saying could be considered like an expression of somehow some other grievance I might have on my side. So, I mean, like,
Tone policing.
It would be like, say, example, say there's like, think of like a simple example at school, for instance. Say there's like a bully who's constantly picking on a kid and sort of like making fun of him for being short, say. And then the short kid makes fun of the bully for being fat and being not smart, right? Both things would be considered sort of incorrect, but like, I guess from like a certain perspective, we would say, okay, well, the bully was the one picking on the kid in the first place. But like, I guess like if you criticized, I guess either side you could say it's tone policing because you could say, well, okay, but you can't criticize the little kid for making fun of the older kid because he still said something which is wrong. I don't know.
Like an example, we talked about this, Jonas, where I was on one of the Facebook groups and made a post. Remember that that controversial post about how people shouldn't be too quick to call out racism. So that was basically the gist of that post. It was longer, but obviously that was the message. And I got called tone police because I said that. That's an example of tone policing. That's what they said was an example of tone policing.
My views are kind of changed on this based off personal experiences, but like basically like, okay, well, some people who get banned on Facebook for saying certain things, like they say that Facebook is tone policing them, but like sometimes some of the stuff they say is actually like sort of like could be very hateful towards other groups of people. But like, I think political correctness also sort of like also assumes maybe a sort of like certain virtues or certain like these things that we need to say as being like these are the correct things we should say, but if they fall out of that, they're not correct. But I don't want to necessarily push that too forward because I also don't fully believe that like certain ideas are necessarily like, I don't think all ideas are valid, I think is what I'm trying to say. As in, I think that certain ideas that's a whole other topic. It's like the paradox of tolerance, right? It's like if you are too tolerant for something, you allow for people to say whatever the heck they want for free speech. Then inevitably, like some group which is intolerant will come forward. But then then the question there lies is like, who do we want to consider intolerant here? Because you could say, hey, I'm intolerant, say, to racism, right? Like I'm anti-racist, and that makes me intolerant to racism, right? And I'm not tolerant to that. So like, how do we want to define things like tolerance in that case?
Do you guys think that's like a huge question. And also, do you guys think there should be any limitations to free speech outside of just, like the screaming fire kind of situation? Some people think like there shouldn't be any limitations at all, and which is concerning because then you allow things like that person should be lynched to kind of circulate because on the grounds of free speech. But then you also have other people who are like, no, there shouldn't be like completely unlimited free speech, and they go more for like the
well, online you probably get away with that, but I'm sure if that was interpersonal, that would be considered a threat. I know. I mean, as far as even this being defined as you can just say whatever you want, I think perhaps the issue isn't so much that people want to say these things, the issue is that this is what they believe. It's sort of circling back to the point of people thinking like, oh, why are you just keeping me from saying what I want to say? Because some people think, oh, well, Mexicans are actually criminals. And you saying, hey, don't say that, they'll consider that, oh, you're just trying to hide the truth for some nefarious purpose of yada, yada, yada. So I think at the root of what we consider political correctness or even these issues, I think we should, for the most part, permit, and this could lead into some other discussion, but Philip could fill in his sense, but people should be able to say what they want, but I don't think that we should necessarily be the most worried about keeping people from saying things they shouldn't say, and the lack of a culture that isn't so tested to teach us out of these sort of situations. At some point, saying like the N word in America was just something you said, but now it's just somehow we've grown to an era where that's just something we just don't accept, and some of these things will happen slower than others, and what we consider decency also has to evolve. But for the most part, I wouldn't say that freedom of speech is something that's obsolete.
I think one thing which sort of allows that there's an idea I hear frequently, right? Which is, free speech, but that means we're free to criticize or like go against someone like as a group who we think has said something which offends like a group of people. Is like, I feel like a lot of what we consider like this is something which we shouldn't say, this is something which is generally not accepted, is sort of something which is cultural and sort of determined by the general like populace, what they think is like a good thing to say. Because yeah, sure, there was a time that certain slurs were really bad. Like I think or were really bad or were really not so like unaccepted in the past. I mean, there was a time when saying the N-word wasn't seen as a bad thing at all. And I mean, for the longest time, even probably recently, there's probably parts of the South where it's still probably not super unaccepted to say that. I mean, like, especially amongst the older populations, it's like, I can only sort of say this because I'm half Asian, but like Oriental, for instance, right? You hear a lot of older people say the word Oriental and they see it as totally accepted. But in a modern day context, you wouldn't want to say Oriental. That's not considered a politically correct thing to say because of its association with yellow peril and other like very harmful xenophobic sentiments from the past. Meanwhile, there's certain slurs such as Polak or Guido or WAP that were used towards, say, early European immigrants in the early 1900s. And even my mom, when she came here in the 60s, these were considered serious slurs you don't want to use. And they're used in a bad way, but today they don't mean anything. Today people don't even really know what they mean. So I think this is what I'm trying to say is that slurs kind of become more and less accepted. And this seems to be sort of judged by the general populace. So that kind of does provide, I'd say, some argument to say, like, okay, free speech, that's fine, but you're not free from criticism. And in some ways, sort of let the people decide what is considered to be good or not. I guess the only time that becomes a problem is if, say, there's a large enough minority of people who don't like something and they go after someone. Meanwhile, the rest of the people are either sort of, ambivalent to it, like they don't really mind about it, or there's one who's like very pro against it, like how dare you call out this person, right? So I guess that's where it becomes problematic, is if you have too many, it doesn't take the majority of the populace to agree on something for something to be considered not correct, or for something people to take action against something. So I guess that's also what I think is another definition of political correctness. Okay, that's my first point, right, is that basically free speech and sort of like what we consider bad or good taboo, it's sort of decided by the general populace. But I guess something else I want to say, and general populace in the culture, right, and the cultures that make up that general populace, but also I wanted to say something else, which is political correctness in some ways seems to be sort of something which is decided based off of sort of the perceived negative effects of saying something. Like, say, example, what we might consider politically incorrect is, say, if the CEO of a company said that, you wouldn't want the CEO of a company to say that because then you'd lose a bunch of sales, right, for instance. Do we consider that something politically incorrect, right? Because that's something which people don't like, or enough people don't like that it's not a good thing. And
I also think the problem herein lies that some people don't really understand what free speech means. And there's like this cognitive dissonance of like actual free speech and what their own interpretation of free speech is. Because you'll have people on the internet who's like, well, this is not what free speech, like people getting doxxed online isn't free speech. Like if I say something and then I get my life ruined, that isn't considered free speech. Actually, I'd like to hear what your take on this is, Philip.
So the thing is that like the government may not be the actor that's essentially, covering your mouth every time you say something that's perceived as offensive, but the unintended consequence of political correctness is that now people are bending over backwards to avoid accusations of racism, even if they're unfounded, right? Like the new conceptions of what is and isn't racist isn't the majority of the public. It's mostly a select group of sociologists that have decided which things are racist. Even if you use Twitter to construe, the origin of what things are cool to be racist now, Twitter is still less than 2% of the population in the United States. The problem is that bending over backwards to avoid criticism has like very meaningful, real harms. There was a case like 4 or 5 years ago in the United Kingdom in Rotherham, where a bunch of children, like thousands of them, were being groomed by pedophile gangs. And a bunch of girls came forward, and almost every single one of them named their abusers. So, like, to be clear, they were beaten and raped. The majority of them were white, and almost all of the offenders were from Pakistan in particular. They weren't just brown people, they were from Pakistan. So the police were focused more on avoiding criticism of looking like they're racist by prosecuting all of them, because, like, externally the behavior would have looked like the police is cracking down on brown people. And this was on the heels of a bunch of sociologists in Britain, like, giving a concerted, rapid fire series of lectures saying the police is racist, and no matter what you do and how well you try and treat everyone, you will always be racist. So, like, it became very hard to, one, deflect those accusations, and those accusations became incredibly popular in the United Kingdom right around the time that this incident happened. So there's very real material effects when you care more about not being accused of something, and as a result of not wanting to look like you're racist, you start doing things that become either tone deaf or dismissive or ignorant, or, in this particular instance, straight up malignant to society at large. Like, another good example is, for instance, BART, the Bay Area transportation system, had a murder on one of its subways, and the assailant was African American. And then BART made a statement saying, we're not releasing the security footage because we don't want to enforce racial stereotypes.
Yeah.
Like, there's a dead person. And the culture of political correctness in this instance became so overbearing that you could make the case that they were obstructing justice because they didn't want to appear offensive. So when political correctness manifests in its worst case scenario, that's what it looks like.
Yeah, I think a lot of that also, it comes from the fact that sometimes, okay, this is going to go back to the tone policing thing, but people often are too worried about, say, the emotional reaction of people. But sometimes people have emotions, but because they have emotional reactions, sometimes that, again, has to go with what we talked about way at the beginning, which is those people had an emotional reaction to the fact you said anti-racist, and they associated with sort of their negative connotations with what was considered anti-racist. Just like in this case, they sort of have a negative connotation, negative emotional reaction to people associating, say like African Americans, or say like recent like refugees from like the Middle East, or like immigrants from say from like South Asia or Middle East, or like North Africa and like Europe case. They have a negative association with those things, and so for a reason, if they have any other negative association, there's a negative emotional reaction to that, and that makes it look like, okay, well, now you said something that offended these people, and so you said something which wasn't politically correct. You said something basically which is cancelable, something which is sort of deserving of censure. But that sort of ignores sort of logically that, well, these people still committed a crime. It's not like we're accusing of something they didn't do. Like, this is something which actually happened. We have evidence of it. It's not just like going on a hunch. It's not like some Karen calling the phone saying, hey, I see a person grilling in the park. I mean, that's a case of racism. This is a case of something that actually happened. It's documented. And now you're trying to go through the legal proceedings of actually punishing these people for committing a crime.
If anybody else, closing statements, if not, then I think that is our episode.
The square button that says a stop record. I'm gonna do the clap sound. That does nothing because no one knows what they're doing with sound, but it makes us feel professional, and we didn't do it at the beginning. Oh, I think what that does is it leaves a big mark in the sound file. So you go over it, there should be like this big old spike, so you know where to end it. So I should really go. And now it's closed. Oh, I'm so good. I'm so professional.
Hey,